Hey everybody, come on in, grab a seat, move into the middle, make a friend. I'm John D., your ringmaster, or master of ceremonies for the afternoon. Soon we will have our first speaker of the afternoon, as you can see up here in 3-story tall slides. Oh my God, this is so cool in the IMAX theater. HD Moore. In fact, let's go ahead and bring him down now. I think he's ready to talk, give you guys an excellent trip through the SSH Multiverse. With no further ado, HD Moore, introduce yourself. Please speak right into the mic. You'll be fine. Thank you, sir.
Cool. Thanks, John. Hey, I can hear. Wow, this theater's huge. I feel like an ant, but thank you so much for coming. This is my first time being back since 2011. I was here for the first B-Sides and then the second one, and then I took 10 years off from public speaking, and I'm finally getting back to it again. So thank you very much, and hopefully I'm not too rusty here, but I'll do my best. So just a quick intro. My name is HD Moore, co-founder, CEO of Run Zero. Most people probably know my work from Metasploit that I did for about 15 years. So today I'm going to talk about charting the SSH multiverse. The idea is that there's a lot of SSH out there, and until about 2023, SSH was pretty boring. And then last year, everything exploded. And this year, it's continuing to get lots of exciting new vulnerabilities and exposures in SSH implementations. So if you haven't been living under a rock, SSH is the second most common admin protocol in the whole world. It is more popular than RDP. It is more popular than anything else except for web interfaces, basically. So if you look at everything from like Shodan graphs and so on, it's either a web interface or it's SSH, and then there's everything else way below that. So it's the most common admin interface. It's not a web UI. It's enabled by default in pretty much everything. It's part of every major OS. It's embedded in every type of thing and IoT device and server and even mobile. So SSH is pretty important, and we want to talk a little bit today about kind of the shape of the ecosystem, some of the exposures, some of the research that's been happening both recently and then even more recently, and then some of our recent findings. So first off, a lot of folks think like, oh, SSH, if you have public key authentication, well, you're good. There's not a whole lot you need to worry about. But there's a lot of stuff that happens in the SSH protocol that happens before you even get to the authentication stage. So even before you get the banner, you have the TCP/IP window size, scaling factor, et cetera. That stuff immediately tells you the kernel version of the system. Now, if you take the server version like OpenSH- whatever, and you combine that with the MSS scaling value from the TCP IP traffic, you can actually narrow down exactly what distribution it is pretty quickly. So even with an unadorned SSH banner like OpenSH 7.4, you can generally nail it down to exactly one of a few distributions with maybe basically one packet in a single connection. Now, once you get into the server version, it gets a lot of fun. Some distros like Ubuntu, Debian, they actually put the specific package version into the banner as well. So you know whether it's patched or not, because it's either running the right package or it's not, right? So you actually get really granular security information from that banner as well on the distributions that put the package name into the version. Now, as you start going forward in the protocol, you start doing handshakes, ciphers, kitmax, key exchange, things like that. You start getting a lot of like really interesting combinations. You start doing really detailed fingerprinting about the configuration of that device. Now you know, okay, it's not just a RHEL device, it's a RHEL image running this thing from this one vendor because of the combination of ciphers that are enabled. Then you get what's called the pre-authentication banner. Now, it's not the same as the SSH banner you typically see. It's actually kind of like a message of the day type thing presented to the screen. And you probably haven't seen a lot of interesting ones if you're just a normal Unix admin. But if you start looking into the world of IoT and embedded devices, you find some crazy stuff. So for example, anyone here, show of hands, know what this little logo is? It's probably, hopefully not too hard to read in this 3-story thing. Okay, at least one person. Anyone else know what that logo is? 2, awesome. That is an Axon body camera on the internet. And it tells you exactly what it is because even before you authenticate to SSH, it says, hey, I'm an Axon body camera. Here's my MAC address. Here's all this information about me. So it's amazing how much information you actually get out of a lot of devices pre-authentication with SSH. Then lastly, even in the authentication phase itself, ends up being really leaky. So if you're using something like the Duo Authenticator, you can actually figure out whose phone number is using the authenticator just by starting the initiation of the authentication flow. And it'll actually tell you, oh, look for the passcode or the text message to this ending phone number, right? So if you need to confirm that, okay, I think this server belongs to this person or company, that's a great way to confirm that. It's just to start the authentication process, be like, yep, that's exactly the link, the URL, the whatever that I expected to see. So the idea here is that you actually get a lot of useful data out of SSH even before you authenticate. Another really fun quirk of SSH is that when you authenticate through a public key, there's 2 stages. First, you say, will you take this key? And the server's like, yeah. Then you say, great, I'm now going to sign my session ID with that key to prove I own that key. But that first part, you can do without actually having the private key of the said key. So if you have a public key from somebody else, like let's say Giatan's public key, you can then ask the server whether it accepts Giatan's public key, even if you don't have his private key or her private key, right? So the idea is that if you're trying to figure out whether a device is adminned by a bad actor, as long as you get a copy of their pub key, you can now find out every server that they have access to. And the internet is small enough now, you can actually mass scan the whole thing in about 4 hours with Shamble plus ZMap, right? So when the XZ backdoor thing happened last year, we went off and scanned the whole internet, trying to find every machine that geotans pub keys from GitHub would actually let you log into. We found thousands, they're all false positives. So that's actually what led to building this whole toolkit, which does a really good job of like randomizing keys, inserting random ones, things like that, to make sure that false positives are actually kind of narrowed down as part of the process. But since then, a lot of folks will, well, there's a couple of the campaigns we helped out with. A friend of mine was tracking one of the Mirai botnets, and the actor in that case was pushing a hard-coded pub key to all the machines that were popping. So we went and looked across the whole internet for what other machines accepted that key, but not on the Mirai targets, but on their home network, basically finding their home development machines. So you can do a lot of really neat OPSEC stuff if you have someone's public key. And where do you get their public key from? You get it from GitHub, right? You go to anyone's username on GitHub and n.keys in the end of the URL, and you have their public key. So same thing with like launchpad.net. You can find public keys in firmware, malware, things like that. So the funny thing about all this is like, it wasn't really intended to be this way. There's a comment in the OpenStates source code saying, is this actually okay? Should we be doing this? But it's just part of the spec at this point, and it's kind of too late to fix it now. Oh, it says that the clock is not running down here, but I'll try to keep an eye on time. So SSH itself, when you get into the protocol itself, it is horrendously complicated. It's basically just a big state machine, though. So as you start going through every state of the protocol, you say, first your version, now my version, now key exchange in it, now new keys handshake, and now we actually do the service request, then we do service accept, then we do authentication. You're just kind of going back and forth through the whole protocol. What's really neat about SSH is that all the different stages of the protocol are incrementing message IDs. So if you're doing something at the very beginning in the clear text phase, those messages are always going to be within a certain window, like message 1 through message 30. As you start getting into the pre-authentication but post-encryption, those message IDs go through a different range of IDs. And then post-authentication, you now start getting messages above 80, and then going 80 all the way to 250, depending on vendor extensions. So theoretically, you can limit the state transitions by saying if it's above this number during the protocol exchange, we don't need to, we can't accept a message beyond this state. And that's really important because people screw it up a lot. Lastly, SSH really is more than just a admin tool. It's actually a secure transport and a secure authentication layer. So keep in mind, just like TLS, your encryption actually happens before you authenticate. So with SSH, you're doing a Diffie-Hellman handshake, and then you're actually agreeing on a key and all that fun stuff. And then you're authenticating over that channel, often clear text authentication of that channel for passwords. Public key is doing like proof signing and stuff like that. Now, the neat thing about this is it's similar to TLS, but it's also different in a really important way, which is TLS, what happens is both sides negotiate and agree on the strongest algorithm shared by both sides. In the case of SSH, however, the server must pick the first preferred cipher from the client that's acceptable. And that's actually what enabled the Terrapin attack last year, is that someone was able to, the attackers were able to, or the researchers were able to basically truncate the packet so that only the cipher they wanted was chosen instead of the one that the client actually preferred to be chosen. And lastly, once you're actually authenticated in SSH, now you can do a million things. SSH is not just a shell, right? You can do concurrent shells. You can have master control sockets. You can do file transfers. You can do TCP port forwarding, Unix socket, agent forwarding, X11 display forwarding, all in the same protocol, all in the same session, all at the same time. So there's a ton of cool things you can do in SSH once that initial control channel is created. So when you look at like the scope of how people admin things on the internet and how you actually secure transports, SSH is effectively another version of TLS in a lot of ways. It actually fits the same kind of niche, if you will, for creating that secure handshake, but it's very different in the sense that key management is not CA-based for the most part. While you can use CAs to manage keys, they're generally not global CAs. They tend to be enterprise-specific CAs instead. So TLS is kind of like a, if you wanted to call it a dodgy version of TLS where you hard-code all your thumbprints, it's not too far off from the truth. So let's go into the ecosystem a little bit. So we all know that OpenSSH is the big thing, right? But where did OpenSSH come from? Well, go all the way back to 1995, and Tatu Yolen created SSH version 1 as like freeware. He continued development, which eventually became the proprietary version of SSH, which is now Tectia. But then Bjorn Gronvold forked Yolen's into OSSH, and then OpenBC forked OSH into OpenSSH. And then the PKIX SSH guys decided they didn't like everybody else, and they created their own version with blackjack and hookers, or at least with X509 certs. And then Dropper created their own separate tree way after the fact. So we have a couple different lines, but the majority of the OpenSSH and SSH we love and use all originally came from Tatu Yolen and his code base, and it's been modified since then. Now, if you go look at the internet, like what is actually exposed on the internet? Well, it's almost all OpenSSH, like vast majority, like more than 90%, something like that is just OpenSSH-based SSH daemons on the internet. And then the second most common, of course, is Dropbear, which is common in embedded devices. But the thing is, like, even though it's the most common implementation, it's not necessarily the most important in a lot of cases. There's a lot of excuse me, very important equipment that runs obscure, weird, hand-coded versions of SSH that are horribly broken. And that's really what I want to focus on today. It's like, what's all the other stuff out there? So yeah, there's fun things you can do with OpenSSH. There's been some great research, but how do we shell everything else for fun? So there's lots of cool stuff. You have like all your ICS IT gear, your firewall, networking, storage stuff, and you also have all your application-specific SSH daemons. So MoveIt has its own SSH engine that licensed from a third party. IPworks, GlobalScape has its own SSH engine. There's all these kind of like one-off vendor implementations. Garrett, for example, uses Apache Mina that are very different from anything else out there, and they've got their own kind of quirks. So don't want to go into too much depth here, but effectively, there's some standalone versions of SSH that are not libraries, that are kind of like their own thing, like Wolf SSH, Cisco IOS, LSH, PKIX, et cetera. Then you have a whole bucket of SSH libraries that are used to embed SSH into applications themselves. So you've got libSSH, which is part of everything. You've got the Go, Xcrypto SSH wrappers, things like Wish and things like that around it. And Java, you've got Mina, Python, Paramiko, Erlang, they've got an SSH module that's been pretty popular lately. But if you start looking to just OpenSSH, OpenSSH itself has been fragmented in a million different ways. So if you look at, you just diff the code for Apple's version of OpenSSH versus like stock, bog standard OpenBSD, OpenSSH P1, right, portable. There's almost no changes in Apple. They did a really good job of only changing a very few things to enable things like the PKS helper, the event logging, endpoint logging, things like that, and just didn't muck with anything else, which is fantastic. So when you're getting OpenSSH on a Mac, it's actually not terrible, and it's good to use. Now you start going further down the line, look at Debian, look at Ubuntu, you're looking at like 30 to 50 patches, depending on the distribution, on top of basic SSH. Like these made these libxc utils backdoor compatible because they link to systemd and from there link to XZ, and normally SSH does not do that. So when you're getting OpenSSH on things like Debian, Ubuntu, Red Hat, and so on, you're getting a very different version of it. You're getting a whole bunch of extra code and different behaviors that aren't actually part of the standard open source or OpenSSH implementation. And then PKIX is like kind of like Wonkyville. Basically, they really hate the OpenSSH developers as far as I can tell. And so instead of copying their changes line for line, they like write the logic slightly different just to be spiteful. And you can feel the hate emanating from that code over the years by doing the diff. You can see like, dang it, I need to copy this change, but I don't want to look like I copied the change. I'm going to do it this way instead. Now, the funniest part about this is like, so I went and diff like every implementation for like 8 months last year and have been keeping up on it since. And PKIX, oftentimes they get the logic wrong when they copy the change. So you'll see a change is like, if not this, do that. And then you see PKIX do the exact inverse of that. Like, that wasn't correct. So far, none of those have turned into security vulnerabilities yet, but like, I probably wouldn't use PKIX at this point, given that it's all spite and wrongness. Now, the one that's the far worse, of course, is Microsoft Windows. So Windows, it was really exciting, finally shipped OpenSSH by default with the platform, right? And that was cool and exciting. The downside, though, is they didn't ship good SSH, they shipped their SSH, and their SSH was OpenSSH that they like monkeyed around with. So we presented on it last year, but effectively they backdoored the most important crypto function in the entire code base by making it carriage return line feed compatible. For a crypto comparison, they made it no longer timing safe. They made it a 1 byte out of bound memory read. Like they managed to screw up literally the most important 3 lines in the entire code base. Lines that had been written by Damian Miller 20 years ago, no one had touched since. They went and mucked with it so it could parse log files differently. It was amazing. So I don't have strong opinions about, well, I probably do, but I wouldn't recommend using OpenSSH on Windows as is, put it that way. Not only does it have a lot of different code, they ripped out all the safe part of it. They pretty much ripped out most of the secure part of it too. But even worse, it also sends telemetry back to Microsoft of the client versions that connect to your server and vice versa. So when telemetry is enabled in SSH, which is on by default, and someone connects to your SSH server on Windows, it's going to take the client version, which is whatever Mac OS or Linux, whatever you're using, and send that straight off to the cloud and say, thanks. So Microsoft sees people SSHing into your servers by default with telemetry, which seems pretty awful. So try not to use the SSH built into Windows by default. So last year was probably the most exciting year in OpenSSH history since the CRC32 exploits and X2.C and all that fun stuff back in the day. And there's great reasons for that. So first off, Fabian Baumer at Ruhr University Bochum came up with a really neat way to break channel integrity by basically truncating the packets on the client side, abusing the fact that if you can do some protocol layer stuff, you can actually make it use a different cipher than expected and downgrade the protocol. And fantastic work, and that became the Terrapin attack. Then, of course, there's Jiatan, our favorite internet contributor, right? So Jiatan was a persona who was probably likely the product of a state actor. They built a nobody but us backdoor, and that the backdoor could only be used by somebody who had the private key that corresponded with the public key in the backdoor. So a nearly perfect backdoor. They targeted the systemd patches that are in Ubuntu, Debian, Red Hat, Fedora, etc., but didn't actually target the normal OpenSH builds kind of as it was. So it wouldn't have affected macOS, for example. And they did a fantastic job of going through and getting their code all the way to shipping, basically, and getting it out there. And it was only caught last minute by Andres Frond. And you probably saw a lot about this last year, but it made it basically into the rolling releases, and it got caught right before it went out to millions of people. So part of this work last year is we decided to go figure out, like, can we go find Geotan's home server by taking their public key and then scanning the internet for it? And that kind of led to this work. And the answer is no, they've got really good OPSEC. So they're well funded and managed to not basically leak their identity even after a 3-year campaign, which is impressive. The other fantastic work last year is by the Qualys Threat Research Unit. These folks came up with an amazing way to abuse a regression in a previous signal reentrance fix, basically, that leads to straight up RCE pre-authentication in OpenSH, like one of the very few in the history of the project. It's really tough to exploit due to the timing. So theoretically, it takes about 6 to 8 hours to get a shell on a device running a 32-bit version of Ubuntu, and then some unknown numbers of days or weeks or months to pop a 64-bit machine, given the ASLR component. And then Solar Designer found a very similar version that only affected Red Hat builds, because Red Hat made their own patches different, which had its own basically issue in that sense. And that one was a little bit less bad because it was limited to the privsep, the non-root privsep user. But the most incredible thing about the Qualys bug is it actually was remote root code execution in its default configuration of OpenSH. That's just something that hasn't really happened in 20 years. So another one that was really fun that I loved last year is the Watchtower guys. If you haven't read their blog posts, they're like 1,000 pages long, and they're hilarious, and they're just like trashing a vendor continuously. It's amazing. So I love their blogs. There's a company called MoveIt that's famous for getting a lot of people ransomware. They also make a file transfer product, and they had the weirdest bug. They had a bug where if you put a file name into the bytes of your public key during the handshake, the server would then read that as a file and then authenticate against it somehow. And it's like, how do you even get there, right? So not only could you use a UNC path, like make your SSH server turn around and connect to whatever path you wanted to, and then give them whatever contents of the key, but they were Watchtower folks were able to turn that into full-blown RCE by having it parse a log file that had a key embedded into it in a funky format and things like that. But the messed up part about this whole thing is the vulnerability wasn't even in MoveIt. It was actually in a third-party IP component called IPworks, so a library licensed by lots of other products. So we never heard about all the other vulnerabilities and all those other products. We only heard about the MoveIt one. But man, those are probably still vulnerable. Anybody who stopped paying their SDK fees, last year, is probably still shipping a vulnerable version of the SSH server for their Windows products. That kind of takes us to where we were last year. So we created this tool called Shamble after we realized how messy everything was, and we went through and just basically threw it up the whole internet for fun and just watched it rain shells out. And we went and figured out some of the bugs and found ways to make that better. And then in this research, I'll talk about some of the improvements we made to it and some of the newer stuff we found. But the idea is that we wanted a tool that spoke the SSH protocol really poorly in really bad ways, and that your normal tooling could really accept. So until about, I don't know, like 5-6 years ago, probably when Paramiko got much better, it was really difficult to write tools that spoke the SSH protocol without writing C and probably creating your own vulnerabilities in your client-side code trying to do these things, right? A lot of my friends would work on like, oh, I'm going to exploit the SSH bug, so I'll patch OpenSH to do it. They end up basically accidentally self-exploiting themselves because it's so finicky to get it right. So it's great having these great libraries like Python, Go, et cetera, that support the low-level protocol side, but some of these libraries weren't quite good enough yet. They really couldn't get you low enough in the protocol to find the types of bugs that we were finding. So we built kind of not just a custom, SSH enumeration tool, but basically a custom version of the SSH protocol stack that allows you to, at any given state of the protocol, say, how about I just get a shell now? How about now? How about now? How about now? And eventually just start dumping things out. So maybe halfway through the authentication process, let's ask it if we can do a port forward. Now halfway through, or maybe pre-authentication, let's ask it just to open a shell, things like that. We also found some neat ways to do timing analysis, different platforms. We had a turbo brute force public keys, so you can grind through millions of keys per second on a couple of machines just by spraying public keys at them because they don't actually limit them. So lots of fun work, but I'm going to talk more about the new stuff here. So with Shamble last year, we found about 110,000 open shells on the internet by just throwing at the whole thing. About 27 million devices with SSH open. This is mostly IPv4 only. About 14 million would negotiate a full SSH session, and then 110,000 were just straight up shells one way or another when it's all said and done. So about 9 different unique vulnerabilities popped out of it. Basically, Ruckus APs, it was an older version of the OS, but easy way to get a shell of remote root. Digi-transport ICS gateways, just straight unauthenticated remote. Panasonic Ethernet switches are still vulnerable as far as I know, so if you have one of those, throw it in the dumpster. And Realtek ADSL gateways, I've never been able to get a response from anybody over there, but like every net bit and like there's this huge pile of equipment that are all built on this Realtek SDK, they're all vulnerable still to remote root just by default. And there's thousands of them on the internet and no one cares. So that's nice. Separately, there's some neat tools that are based on the Go SSH library, like SoftServe and GOGS, that we also found some RC bugs or authentication bypass bugs in. And we actually got scooped by one of them. The GOGS bug, another company, Sonar Source, reported it like 2 weeks before we did. So they managed to scoop us on the disclosure there. And then we also started digging into like OpenSH for Windows and a couple other products. And this is where we found like the out-of-bands memory leak and the weird backdoor in Windows OpenSH. And then we're for Ion Network service access points, just kind of an oddball kind of legacy device. They'll actually do port forwarding out of the box even before you log in, which is fun. So you just like create a session to them and start just proxying through it and start hitting everything behind the device in the network. And eventually it'll time you out saying, you didn't log in time. I'm like, great, well, I've already owned your whole backend network, so it doesn't matter now. And another fun bug that popped out of this was the unlimited public key testing. So taking the entire GitHub key database, for example, of 117 million users, finding someone's like Dropbear server, and is jamming all 117 million keys through that server to figure out who actually owns that box. So if your public key and your username is available somewhere, you can find out, someone else can find out whether you've got access to a particular machine. And as far as I know, Dropbear never responded to emails on that, doesn't care. So you can still do that. So going into more recent research. So the Qualys folks again dumped out yet another cool bug. And this time they found a way to do man-in-the-middle attacks or machine-in-the-middle attacks against OpenSH clients. And they did that by actually causing the SSH client to run out of memory in a very like tricky way, and that causes a particular error condition to hit and so on. They also found a pre-authentication denial of service that caused out of memory on the server side by stacking ping messages in the protocol. So you think this code's been around for a very long time, and yet we're still finding really cool bugs in it. But only because the Qualys team's looking, apparently. They're the only ones capable of finding cool bugs like this, it seems like. Them and Solar Designer. The Go stack actually had another interesting bug where the default Go Xcrypto SSH stack would call the authentication handler every time a public key is received. That includes every tested key, not the full key. So you could take a big list of keys, and each time you send it to the server, it would call this function, cache it, and then later on when you did your real authentication, sometimes it would use the wrong key in the wrong state, and you can basically authenticate as a different user entirely by sending their pub key, but then authenticating with your private key with a different key entirely. So this is a fun one, and actually mostly the only real commercial case I know where of an application affected was the NetApp Telegraph agent. And it's partially mitigated through an OS update, a library update, but you can still shoot yourself in the foot if you do it the wrong way. Another great project that has really taken off last year is Hanno Bach has this project called badkeys.info. Is anyone aware of it? Okay, a couple, awesome. It is amazing. Like he's like hasn't really been like marketing the hell out of it, but it's really cool. It includes like an entire scanning toolkit for SSH, TLS, DKIM, etc. It can negotiate SNTP. It can basically pull keys out of almost anything, and does really cool both cryptographic analysis of the key for weaknesses for all kinds of fun attacks like Fermat. And then it also has a giant database he's created of known bad keys that have leaked. This includes like all the old bad keys repos that we built at Rapid7, some other like SecList repos, things like that. And then more recently, he took the entire Fortinet public dump that got leaked to the dark web, scraped all the SSH keys and private keys out of the dumped Fortinet configuration files, put those into bad keys. So if you want to know whether your Fortinet device's SSH keys got leaked, you can now just query the bad keys block list and find out. And the whole thing is super efficient. It's like a 200 meg blob when you download it, and it's all done through binary search and kind of partial hashes and things like that. So really cool project, and we're making use of it now in Shamble as well. But the more fun bug recently was the Erlang OTP SSH bug. Now this is great because so I'm not a huge fan of AI for the most part. I think it's kind of a waste of time. Like I don't need to talk to my spell checker that often. But the way that a lot of folks use AI is kind of funny. They're like, hey, we are able to get AI to generate an exploit for the Erlang OTP bug. It's like, guys, the exploit was in the unit test that was committed in the fix. It's right there. It's literally the same. So this particular bug is funny because it's a state machine bypass, where if you send an exec command prior to authenticating, Erlang would just run arbitrary Erlang code. So it's remote code execution in the Erlang sense. Like you don't even have to create a binary payload. You don't have to do anything tricky. You just straight up say hey, run some Erlang, buddy. And it's like, okay, it's great. So what was really weird about this though is why didn't we find it? We tested this exact scenario a million times. You could not figure out why we missed this, right? So we started digging into it, and the funny thing about this particular bug is that a lot of folks were exploiting it before the Diffie-Hellman handshake. So their exploits were actually being sent clear text after the key exchange, or the kex in it, but before the key exchange. So it ends up we missed it because our SSH stack was waiting for a reply to the channel open request before it would send the exec request. And in this case, the Erlang code does not send a reply at all in that case. It basically just doesn't send anything. But if you happen to send a channel open, then you send an exec, it just runs the code, and it's completely blind. It's almost like a blind SQLi. It's a blind code exec in this case. So it's tough to test for because there's a lot of devices that have the exact same behavior, but don't actually just randomly run your code. Like all the Cisco iOS stuff, for example, works the same way. If you send an exec, a channel open and an exec, you don't get a reply, but it's not hopefully running your code. So the real world impact is like nobody really uses Erlang SSHD as it is in the wild. There's like 3 of them in a given day on Shodan. There's like 42 over the course of 3 months. So it's not really important in that sense, unless you look at the products that embed it. In this case, the netconf server of most recent Cisco installs, all the Cisco iOS XE stuff, is all based on Erlang. And there's a lot of those. So there's about 3,000 or 4,000 internet that have port 830 open or 2022 or 2024, typically not port 22. That's usually the different SSH implementation. And of course, in this case, Cisco said there's no patch till May, so good luck, guys. Hope you figure out how to turn it off. But if you'd like to patch your own conf servers, it's actually really easy. You take the exploit off the internets, and instead of telling it to run arbitrary OS command or whatever, you just tell it sh:/stop, and it'll actually kill the SSH daemon entirely. So you can quickly self-patch your own Erlang boxes just by telling it to stop the SSH daemon, which is great. So cool. So we did a big update to Shamble. It's all live right now. So if you go to github.com, run0ing/shamble with 2 S's, you can get the latest stuff. We added automatic bad keys info block list lookup. So as you're doing scans, it'll say, yeah, it's a known bad key or not. It'll tell you whether it's got like a bad crypto key or it's using the old Debian open source random generator, things like that. We added a bunch of new auth bypass methods, including ones related to the Erlang ones. It's off by default because it's a little bit buggy. We added much wider algorithm host key support. The next big update is going to add all the post-quantum stuff, but we're almost there. I'm just trying to get all the Go tip changes merged in. And yeah, the experimental blind exec stuff is there if you want to enable the checks for it. But the nice thing is you can take Shamble, and it's a binary that runs on any OS. You can just throw it at any network you want, and it just randomly rains shells out, which is fun. So over the last few months, we've been getting random emails from folks saying, hey, I just ran this thing, and like this random quantum table library gave me a shell. I'm like, cool. Is there a known CV? No. Okay, whatever. Like, just there's so much garbage out there that sometimes it helps just have a vacuum cleaner for extra shells out there effectively. What's weird about this work is that you generally don't want to do all this type of scanning against OpenStation drop bear because we already know what those bugs are. Like those implementations are pretty solid. So we added a new option called skip versions, and you give it a regex of like, OpenSH, pipe, drop bear, et cetera. And it'll skip all the really like time intensive checks on those platforms and just do the really interesting checks on the less common SSH implementations. So this means going from hitting an entire 10/8 in your internal network in like 4 hours to in about 30 seconds because there's very few devices out there that are these oddball weird ones, and they're the ones that have the most likelihood of returning a shell. So we did kind of a I did a rescan last night. So if all your alarms went off last night, it's because I ran Shamble against everything on the internet again. What's different from last year is interesting. We went from 27 million devices with port 22 to about 22 million, but most of the ones that are no longer online were all honeypots and tarbits. So there's actually more real SSH servers online than there were last year, but less total port 22, which is interesting. So up to 15.4 million. And of the 110,000 random shells we got last year, I got 48,000 last night. So we're making progress. Not quite there yet, but it's half what it was before. So this is excluding like the normal missing paths, like OpenStation old, things like that. A lot of these bugs, the top 3 ones are effectively use of hard-coded or reuse host keys, different kinds of authentication bypass, and of course, pre-authentication port forwarding are all super common. So here's a list of the checks that are currently in Shamble. Some of the new ones down here are like the vuln exec skip off, the bad keys block list. Shamble's super easy to run. It's Go. You just compile it, drop it wherever you want to, whatever OS. Tell it to go Shamble scan whatever. It spits out a big old JSON file, and you can just grep shells out of it. You can also tell it to do everything from like give it a list of passwords, give it a list of users, tell it to give it a giant list of SSH keys to go hunt against, and it'll actually try to like try all those auth keys on all your machines. So really use case for like your blue team. Like let's say you had a SSH key for a public key you use for a bunch of automation, and you got rid of it, and you want to make sure all your servers no longer accept that public key, but you don't actually want to put the private key in something and try it. Well, you can give Shamble just the public key side of it, tell it to scan your internal network, and it'll say, oh yeah, you're actually still using this public key over here. So it's got some pretty practical purposes for just internal security. You just give it all the keys that should no longer be used in your environment, whether it's a user that's no longer there, whether it's a hard-coded service key, and you can quickly get a list of all the devices that still accept that key. And the neat thing about Shamble is it actually lets you do a very specific interaction. So you can say, I want to scan this network, and when you get a shell, drop me into an interactive shell, and automatically run pty set environment ld debug all, and then run the shell command. And you can give it whatever commands you want, right? So you can tell it to run set crazy environment variables, all kinds of things that are really pain in the butt to do through OpenSH directly. The interactive shell is neat because you can do TCP port forwarding, you can send arbitrary signals to the backend process, you can make it segv, which is a lot of fun. There's this great service that when you pre-authentication, it gives you a login shell, but you can tell, at that point, you can set it a signal. And if you send it the signal segv, it goes, I died. It's great. It has the funniest error message ever. So you can also send arbitrary strings to it if you want to like if you want to just stuff random garbage into authentication prompts, you can do that through the send command with a bunch of hex edit stuff. But yeah, it's a lot of fun. Happy scanning. And I got one tiny little bit, and then we'll go to questions here. So bonus. So part of writing Shamble is we also worked on a library called xcrypto, which merges the old zcrypto work from the ZMAP guys with Go tip and basically the dev version of Go and a bunch of Shamble tweaks. And this gives you a single library that can speak SL3 all the way through TLS 1.3. And then very soon all the post-quantum crypto stuff, all part of the same library. So if you look at how other tools do it, like Nuclei, for example, Nuclei supports 3 totally different TLS methods and uses all 3 independently as part of its scanning because it tries to cover these backwards and forwards compatibility, including shelling out to the OpenSL command line directly. We don't want to do that. That's crappy. So instead, we're going to put it all in one big library and let you just call it, and it'll do the right thing depending on what you do. What's also cool about this is it uses the permissive ASN parser that came from the ZMAP side. So if you have a certificate that's absolute garbage, but you still need to parse it and do things with it, a lot of parsers will just blow up, say, I can't read this thing. In our case, we'll parse it anyways and then let you pull all the data you want out of it, even though it's like a broken ASN format. And you can find a lot of really hard to find fields in that data as a result. So you can find that project at xcrypto. We're really hoping to start PRing requests to other major security projects to start using this thing because it's a much nicer way to do it than shelling out to 3 different libraries. And thank you very much.
All right, let's hear it for HD.